Stop everything for a moment, because what happened in the narrow waters of the Middle East has sent shockwaves across the entire planet. In the early hours of a tense and uncertain morning, something unusual began to unfold across the global shipping network. Radar screens inside maritime control centers started showing strange patterns. Oil tankers that were supposed to pass through one of the world's busiest waterways suddenly slowed down, then stopped. Some ships began turning around, others anchored in open water, waiting for instructions. Inside international shipping companies, phones began ringing nonstop. Captains were asking for guidance. Logistics teams were scrambling to reroute vessels. Insurance companies were issuing urgent warnings to fleets operating in the Persian Gulf. At first, many people thought it was just another temporary disruption, but within minutes, the situation became much more serious. Military monitoring stations in the region began reporting unusual naval activity. Surveillance systems picked up signals of potential threats in the waterway. Maritime safety agencies started sending out emergency alerts to all ships operating nearby. Then the reason became clear. Iran had effectively shut down the Strait of Hormuz, one of the most critical oil transportation routes on the planet. The moment that news reached global markets, the reaction was immediate. Energy traders sitting in financial hubs like London, New York City, and Singapore began rapidly buying oil futures, anticipating a supply shock. Screens across trading floors turned red and green as prices started moving at lightning speed. Within hours, oil prices surged dramatically, climbing toward $120 per barrel. For many analysts, this was a terrifying signal. Oil prices don't normally jump that fast unless something major is happening. Financial markets began reacting almost immediately. Stock indexes dipped as investors worried about rising energy costs. Airline stocks dropped sharply. Shipping companies warned of delays and rising operational expenses. Governments around the world began holding emergency meetings. Energy ministers called crisis briefings. Economic advisors rushed to assess the potential damage. Leaders wanted to know one thing: how long could this disruption last? Because if the shutdown continued, the consequences could spread far beyond the Middle East. Inside global newsrooms, reporters worked through the night trying to confirm what was happening. Satellite images of the region were examined closely. Analysts debated whether the disruption was temporary or the beginning of a much larger geopolitical crisis. Meanwhile, in the waters near the strait, tension was rising. Commercial vessels waited nervously outside the shipping lane. Some captains reported receiving warnings advising them not to enter the area. Others were instructed by their companies to stay far away until the situation became clearer. Every hour that passed added more uncertainty, and uncertainty is something global markets fear the most. The Strait of Hormuz may look small on a world map, but in reality it holds enormous power over the global economy. This narrow stretch of water connects the Persian Gulf to the Gulf of Oman, creating a critical pathway for oil exports from some of the world's largest energy producers. Massive oil tankers travel through this route every single day, carrying crude oil to countries across Asia, Europe, and North America. If that flow suddenly stops, the ripple effects spread everywhere. Factories begin worrying about fuel supplies. Airlines fear rising jet fuel prices. Shipping companies prepare for massive delays, and ordinary drivers may soon face higher gasoline prices at the pump. But in the early hours of this crisis, nobody yet knew how serious the situation would become. Was this a short-term political warning, a military standoff, or the start of a full-scale disruption to global energy supply? Analysts on television networks began explaining the potential consequences. Some warned that if the Strait of Hormuz remained closed for even a few days, markets would experience serious volatility, but if the disruption lasted weeks, the global economy could face one of its biggest energy shocks in decades. This fear quickly spread beyond energy markets. Investors worried about inflation rising again. Central banks feared new economic pressure just as many countries were still recovering from previous financial slowdowns. For businesses already struggling with high costs, the idea of $120 oil was alarming. For developing economies, it could be devastating. Meanwhile, citizens around the world began noticing the headlines appearing on their phones and television screens. Oil prices surge. Shipping halted in Strait of Hormuz. Global markets on edge. The story was rapidly becoming the biggest international news event of the day, and yet, many people were still asking the same question. How could one narrow waterway hold so much power over the entire world? The answer lies in geography, energy, and decades of global dependence on oil, because the Strait of Hormuz isn't just another shipping route. It is one of the most important economic lifelines on Earth, and when that lifeline suddenly stops flowing, the effects can be felt everywhere, from Wall Street trading floors to gas stations thousands of miles away. That is why the world held its breath when the news broke. Because what was happening in that narrow strip of water could soon impact billions of people. But to truly understand why this moment was so dangerous, you first have to understand just how important the Strait of Hormuz really is. The Strait of Hormuz is not just another shipping lane on the world map. It is the beating heart of the global energy system. At first glance, the strait might look like a small stretch of water connecting to larger bodies of sea. But in reality, this narrow passage holds enormous power over the modern world. Almost every major economy depends on what flows through this route every single day. The Strait of Hormuz sits between Iran to the north and Oman to the south. It connects the Persian Gulf to the Gulf of Oman, creating the only sea route for oil exports from some of the largest petroleum-producing nations on Earth every single day. Massive oil tankers pass through this narrow waterway. These ships are some of the largest vessels ever built by humans, floating giants, capable of carrying millions of barrels of crude oil across oceans. They move slowly but steadily through the strait, forming a constant stream of energy flowing. From the Middle East to the rest of the world, the oil carried by these tankers comes from major producers like Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Kuwait, and the United Arab Emirates. After passing through the Strait of Hormuz, these shipments travel to energy-hungry economies around the globe, especially in Asia, Europe, and North America. And here's the shocking part. Nearly 20% of the world's total oil supply moves through this single passage. Think about that for a moment. Out of every 5 barrels of oil used anywhere on Earth, one of them likely passed through the Strait of Hormuz. That oil fuels cars and trucks. It powers airplanes and cargo ships. It keeps factories running and electricity systems operating in many ways. This narrow corridor helps power the entire modern world, which means when something goes wrong there, the consequences can spread incredibly fast. If shipping traffic through the strait suddenly slows down or stops completely, the effects ripple across the entire global economy. Energy markets react first. Oil traders begin buying and selling contracts at lightning speed, trying to predict how much supply could be lost. Prices begin rising quickly as fears of shortages spread through financial markets. Then industries start feeling the pressure. Factories that depend on steady fuel supplies begin calculating how long their reserves will last. Airlines worry about the cost of jet fuel, which is one of their largest operating expenses. Even a small increase in oil prices can cost airline companies billions of dollars over time. Shipping companies also face major challenges. If tankers cannot safely pass through the Strait of Hormuz, cargo routes around the world become disrupted. Ports may experience delays, supply chains may slow down, and international trade could suffer serious interruptions. But the impact doesn't stop there. Eventually, rising oil prices begin affecting ordinary people. Gasoline prices at fuel stations start climbing. Transportation costs increase. Food prices may rise because trucks and shipping systems rely heavily on fuel. In other words, a disruption in one narrow waterway can slowly spread through the entire global economy, affecting billions of people, many of whom may not even know where the Strait of Hormuz is located on a map. That is why governments around the world monitor this region so closely. The strait has long been considered one of the most sensitive and strategically important locations in global energy security over the years. Tensions in the region have occasionally threatened to disrupt shipping traffic, but in most cases, international naval forces and diplomatic pressure have helped keep the route open. However, the recent situation has raised new fears in the past few days. Tanker traffic moving through the Strait of Hormuz dropped dramatically. Several shipping companies began warning their vessels to stay away from the area due to increasing military tensions and reports of possible attacks on ships. Some captains reported receiving security alerts advising them to wait outside the region until the situation became safer. As a result, several large oil tankers slowed their approach or completely turned back before entering the strait. This sudden drop in traffic sent shockwaves through global energy markets. Because the world's energy system depends heavily on constant movement, oil must keep flowing to maintain stable supply levels. When that flow is disrupted, briefly the entire system begins to feel the strain. Energy analysts started warning that if tanker traffic remained limited for several days or weeks, oil supplies could tighten significantly. Countries that rely heavily on imported energy, especially large economies in Asia, would be among the first to feel the impact. Refineries might struggle to secure enough crude oil. Fuel prices could spike sharply, and governments may be forced to release emergency reserves to stabilize markets. Suddenly, the global supply chain that powers the modern world was facing a very real threat. A single choke point, only a few dozen miles wide, had become the focus of international concern. Ships were waiting, markets were watching, governments were preparing for the worst, because when the flow of energy through the Strait of Hormuz slows down, the entire world feels the pressure. The sudden closure of the Strait of Hormuz did not happen overnight. It was the result of weeks of rising tension, political warnings, and military signals that had slowly been building across the Middle East. For years, the region has remained one of the most sensitive geopolitical hotspots in the world. But recently, the situation became even more unstable as tensions escalated between Iran, the United States, and Israel. The crisis began with a series of military confrontations and political confrontations that pushed the region closer to conflict. Diplomatic negotiations were failing. Accusations were flying across international media, and military forces on all sides began increasing their presence in strategic areas. Naval ships, fighter jets, and surveillance aircraft were deployed across the Persian Gulf as each side tried to demonstrate strength at first. The warnings sounded like familiar political rhetoric, but then the tone began to change. Iranian officials issued increasingly serious statements, warning that if their country faced further pressure or military action, they could respond by disrupting shipping in the Strait of Hormuz at first. Many analysts believed the warnings were mainly meant as political leverage, but then the situation escalated. Reports began emerging from regional intelligence sources, suggesting that Iranian naval forces had increased activity in the waters surrounding the strait. Patrol boats were seen moving through strategic areas, and monitoring stations reported unusual movements of military equipment along the coastline. Then came the most alarming reports. Several security analysts and maritime authorities claimed that Iranian forces had deployed naval mines in parts of the shipping lanes. Naval mines are extremely dangerous weapons, small, hidden explosives placed underwater that can damage or destroy large vessels. Unlike missiles or aircraft attacks, naval mines can remain invisible beneath the surface, making them difficult to detect and even harder to remove quickly for commercial shipping companies. That possibility alone was enough to trigger panic. If the shipping lanes were mined, even a single explosion could endanger hundreds of crew members and cause massive environmental damage from oil spills, and unfortunately, the fears did not remain theoretical for long. Soon after the warnings surfaced, reports began coming in that multiple commercial vessels in the region had been struck or damaged while traveling near the shipping corridor. Some ships reported explosions near their hulls. Others reported sudden impacts that forced crews to abandon their vessels as emergency alarms sounded. Rescue operations were quickly launched to evacuate sailors and assess the damage. Images from the region showed damaged ships drifting in open water while nearby vessels rushed to assist the crews. The news spread quickly across international media, triggering widespread alarm among governments and shipping companies. Within hours, several of the world's largest maritime transport companies began suspending operations in the region. Captains were instructed to keep their ships far away from the strait until the situation became clearer. Oil tankers carrying millions of barrels of crude oil began waiting outside the entrance to the Persian Gulf, UNABLE, or unwilling to risk entering the dangerous waterway. Some ships anchored in nearby waters, hoping the crisis would pass quickly. Others began changing routes entirely, even though alternative paths would add thousands of miles to their journeys. But rerouting giant oil tankers is not easy. Many refineries and energy markets depend on oil arriving on precise schedules. Even a short delay can disrupt supply chains that stretch across continents. Meanwhile, the financial consequences were becoming clear. Insurance companies that provide protection for commercial ships in higher-risk areas began raising their premiums dramatically in some cases. Insurance costs for vessels entering the Strait of Hormuz skyrocketed overnight. For shipping companies, this created another difficult decision. Even if the strait technically remained open, the financial risk of sailing through it had suddenly become extremely high. Many companies decided it was simply too dangerous. As a result, traffic through the strait slowed dramatically. Oil tankers waited. Cargo ships paused their routes. Energy traders watched every new report coming from the region, and the global oil market reacted quickly. Prices surged as investors feared that millions of barrels of oil per day could soon disappear from the global supply. But perhaps the most alarming development came from official statements issued by Iranian authorities. Several officials warned that if the conflict in the region continued to escalate, Iran could take even stronger actions to block energy exports passing through the Strait of Hormuz. Some analysts interpreted these statements as a signal that the situation could become much worse. Energy experts warned that if the disruption continued or If the strait were fully blocked, global oil prices could skyrocket far beyond current levels. Some predictions suggested that oil could potentially climb toward $200 per barrel if the supply shock became severe enough. Such a price surge would not simply affect the oil industry. It would send shockwaves through the entire global economy. Transportation costs would soar, airline ticket prices could rise sharply, food production and shipping expenses would increase. Inflation could surge in many countries already struggling with economic pressure. In short, what began as a regional conflict was rapidly transforming into a global economic threat. The Strait of Hormuz had once again become the center of international attention. Military forces were watching, energy markets were reacting, and governments around the world were preparing for what might happen next. Because if tensions continued rising in this narrow but critical waterway, the consequences could be felt in every corner of the world. As soon as global financial markets opened, the reaction was immediate. Energy traders around the world rushed to their screens, watching the price of crude oil climb rapidly. Within minutes of trading, oil prices surged toward $120 per barrel, sending a wave of concern through financial centers across the globe. The sudden spike shocked investors. Inside trading floors in New York City, London, and Tokyo, analysts and traders scrambled to understand how serious the disruption could become. The reason behind the surge was clear. With the Strait of Hormuz facing severe disruption, the world suddenly feared that a major portion of global oil supply might disappear from the market. When supply becomes uncertain, prices almost always move upward, and this time, the movement was dramatic. Stock markets began reacting quickly as investors realized that expensive energy could affect almost every industry. Airline stocks dropped sharply as companies anticipated higher fuel costs. Transportation companies saw their shares slide. Manufacturing firms worried about rising operational expenses for many countries. The consequences of expensive oil could be extremely serious. Oil is not just another commodity, it is the foundation of modern economic activity. Nearly every sector of the global economy depends on affordable energy to function smoothly. When oil prices rise sharply, the effects spread quickly across industries and households. Higher oil prices mean expensive transportation. Trucks that carry goods across countries require fuel. Cargo ships, transporting products between continents, rely on large quantities of oil. Even local delivery services depend on gasoline or diesel. When fuel prices increase, the cost of moving goods rises as well. Those costs are eventually passed on to businesses and consumers. Higher oil prices also lead to rising food prices. Farmers rely on fuel to operate tractors, harvest crops, and transport food to markets. Fertilizers and agricultural chemicals are also connected to the energy industry. If energy becomes more expensive, farming operations become more costly. That means groceries could soon cost more for millions of families. Electricity prices may also rise in many regions. Although some countries rely on renewable energy or nuclear power, many electricity systems still depend on oil or natural gas for power generation. If energy markets remain unstable, electricity bills could increase for households and businesses. But the biggest long-term risk is slower economic growth. High energy prices can act like a hidden tax on the global economy. Businesses spend more money on fuel. Consumers have less money available. For other purchases, investment slows down and economic expansion can weaken. That is why governments across the world reacted quickly as oil prices climbed. Emergency meetings were held in several capitals as leaders tried to understand how long the crisis might last and what actions might be necessary. Energy ministers, economic advisors, and central bank officials gathered to discuss possible strategies to protect their economies from the shock. One of the first major responses came from the International Energy Agency, often known as the IEA. The organization represents many of the world's largest energy-consuming nations and plays an important role during global energy crises. In response to the sudden market panic, the IEA announced plans to release large quantities of oil from emergency strategic reserves. Strategic petroleum reserves are massive underground storage facilities where countries store oil for emergency situations. These reserves are designed specifically for moments like this, when global supply is suddenly threatened by war, natural disasters, or geopolitical conflict. The plan was to release hundreds of millions of barrels of oil from these reserves in order to stabilize markets and reassure traders that additional supply could be made available for a moment. The announcement helped calm some of the panic. Energy markets stabilized slightly as traders realized that governments were prepared to act. But many experts warn that strategic reserves are not a permanent solution. They can help stabilize markets. Temporarily, they can buy time, but they cannot replace a major global oil supply route indefinitely. If the disruption in the Strait of Hormuz continues for weeks or even months, the reserves could eventually run out or become insufficient to offset the supply loss. That is why analysts around the world continued watching developments in the region very closely. If shipping traffic through the strait returns to normal quickly, markets may calm down, but if the disruption continues, the economic consequences could grow more severe. Airlines might begin reducing flights in order to control fuel costs. Manufacturing industries could slow production if energy becomes too expensive. Shipping companies might increase transportation prices dramatically, and inflation could rise again in many countries, placing additional pressure on households already dealing with high living costs. In other words, the impact of this crisis is not limited to oil companies or energy markets. It could reach every corner of the global economy, from large corporations to small businesses, from international trade routes to local grocery stores, and from government budgets to family household expenses. A disruption in one narrow waterway, thousands of miles away, could ultimately affect billions of people. Because in today's interconnected world, energy flows connect nearly every nation. And when those flows are suddenly threatened, the effects spread far beyond the region where the crisis began. If the situation stabilizes, markets may recover, but if tensions continue and the Strait of Hormuz remains disrupted, the economic shock could be felt in homes, businesses, and industries all across the planet. Right now, the world stands at a dangerous crossroads. What began as a regional security crisis has quickly turned into a global concern, and the next steps taken by world powers could determine whether the situation stabilizes or spirals into something far more serious. At the center of it all is the Strait of Hormuz, a narrow but incredibly important passage that connects the Persian Gulf to the Gulf of Oman. Although the waterway is only a few dozen miles wide at its narrowest point, it carries an enormous responsibility for the global economy every day. Dozens of massive oil tankers normally travel through this corridor, transporting millions of barrels of crude oil from the Middle East to markets around the world. But now, that flow has slowed dramatically and uncertainty is spreading across global markets. In response to the growing crisis, military forces from several countries have begun increasing their presence in the region. Naval fleets are moving closer to the Strait of Hormuz in an effort to protect commercial shipping routes and ensure that international trade can continue safely. The United States Navy has long maintained a strong presence in the area, operating patrols and escort missions designed to protect ships passing through the strait. Meanwhile, regional powers and allies including Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, and Oman are closely monitoring the situation. Their economies depend heavily on the steady export of oil through this critical shipping lane. Any long-term disruption could threaten national revenues, regional stability, and global energy supply. However, while military forces are preparing to secure the shipping lanes, tensions in the region remain extremely high. Diplomatic relations between Iran and several Western countries have become increasingly strained. Political leaders are exchanging strong warnings. Military analysts are closely watching troop movements and naval deployments, and every new development is being analyzed by global markets and international media. In situations like this, even a small incident can escalate quickly. A misunderstanding at sea. An accidental confrontation between naval vessels. Or a misinterpreted signal during a tense moment. Any of these events could push the crisis into a more dangerous phase. That is why many governments are working urgently behind the scenes, attempting to reduce tensions through diplomacy. International organizations and mediators are encouraging dialogue, hoping to prevent the situation from escalating further, because the stakes are incredibly high. If shipping through the Strait of Hormuz resumes quickly, the global energy system could stabilize within a relatively short time. Oil prices might fall back to normal levels. Shipping routes would reopen, markets would regain confidence, and the crisis could slowly fade into history as another tense moment that was successfully managed. But if the disruption continues, the consequences could be enormous. Energy experts warn that a prolonged blockade or continued military confrontation could trigger a chain reaction across the global economy. Oil supplies could tighten dramatically, prices could surge far beyond current levels. Transportation costs would increase. Industries that rely heavily on energy, such as aviation, shipping, manufacturing, and agriculture, could face serious financial pressure. In extreme scenarios, the world could even face the risk of a global recession, as high energy costs slow economic growth and reduce consumer spending. Inflation could rise again in many countries, placing additional strain on governments already dealing with economic challenges. Central banks might be forced to reconsider their financial strategies. Businesses could delay investments, and global markets could experience prolonged instability beyond the immediate economic effects. The crisis could also reshape international energy politics. Countries that rely heavily on Middle Eastern oil may begin accelerating their search for alternative energy sources and new supply routes. Investments in renewable energy could increase. Energy alliances between countries might shift, and long-term strategies for energy security could change dramatically. For decades, experts have warned that the Strait of Hormuz represents one of the most critical choke points in global energy supply. A choke point is a narrow route that carries an extremely large volume of trade or resources. If that route is disrupted, the impact spreads quickly across global systems, and today, the world is witnessing exactly why the Strait of Hormuz has earned that reputation. It may appear small on a map, just a thin line of water between two coastlines, but its importance to the global economy is enormous. Every tanker that passes through it carries energy that powers cities, industries, transportation networks, and economies around the world. Which means that when the flow of oil through this narrow corridor is threatened, the consequences are felt everywhere. From energy markets in New York City to manufacturing centers in Shanghai, to airports, factories, and households across every continent. And that is why the world is watching so closely right now. Governments are monitoring every development, energy markets are reacting to every piece of news, and millions of people are waiting to see what happens next. Will diplomacy calm the situation and reopen the shipping lanes? Will military escorts restore confidence for commercial vessels? Or will tensions continue rising, pushing the crisis into a more dangerous phase? At this moment, no one can say for certain, but one thing is clear. The fate of a narrow stretch of water in the Middle East now holds the attention of the entire planet. And as ships wait outside the strait, and global markets remain on edge, one question continues to echo across the world. Will the tankers return to the Strait of Hormuz, or is this only the beginning of a much larger global crisis? If you want to stay updated with the latest world news and breaking stories, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us bring you more important updates every day.